The sound came first, a ragged scraping against the hard-packed earth outside her cabin, followed by the thud of a heavy body meeting the unyielding wood of her door. Eliza Stowe did not startle. She had lived alone on this ridge for 7 years, and the sounds of the wilderness were a familiar language. This, however, was a dialect of desperation she had not heard since the war. She set her mending aside, the needle still threaded with coarse brown cotton, and rose from her simple chair by the hearth. The firelight cast her shadow long and thin against the log walls, a stark silhouette of a woman pared down to her essentials. She was 34, though the fine lines around her eyes and the single stark streak of silver in her dark hair might have argued for more. Her hands, calloused from the axe and the garden but still nimble from a decade of stitching flesh, rested for a moment on the rough-hewn table. She opened the door, not with fear, but with a weary preparedness. Sprawled on her stoop was a man, one leg tangled in the stirrup of a sweat-soaked roan that stood trembling, its breath pluming in the crisp evening air. The man was a heap of denim and dust, his face turned from her, but the dark, wet stain spreading across his thigh and soaking into the thirsty wood of her porch told the whole story. It was a story she knew by heart. She stepped out, the cold seeping through her woolen stockings, and knelt beside him. The air was thick with the coppery scent of blood, a smell so familiar it no longer moved her. With practiced hands, she felt for the pulse in his neck. It was there, thready but insistent. He moaned, a low, guttural sound of pure animal pain, as she worked to free his boot from the stirrup. The horse shied, but she spoke to it in a low, calm voice, the same one she used for fevered men and frightened children. "Easy now. Easy." The animal quieted, its large, dark eye fixed on her. She managed to untangle the man, and with a strength born of necessity, began to drag him inside. He was heavy, all dead weight and limp muscle, and the effort sent a burn through her shoulders and back. She got him over the threshold, his boots scraping grooves in the floorboards she had planned herself, and maneuvered him toward the narrow cot that served as her own bed. It would have to do. The examination table was for birthing and butchering, and this felt like something in between. With him finally settled, his head lolling on her one good pillow, she moved with an economy of motion that was its own kind of grace. She stoked the fire, adding logs until it roared to life, casting dancing shadows that made the small cabin feel both smaller and more alive. She hung a kettle of water over the flames to boil, the metal hook groaning under the weight, from a worn leather satchel, her only true inheritance from a husband long dead and a life long gone. She retrieved her tools, a sharp pair of scissors, a curved needle, a spool of silk thread, and a bottle of whiskey 3/4 full. It was meant for pain, inside and out. She poured a generous measure onto a clean strip of linen torn from an old shift. The sharp, alcoholic scent cut through the smell of blood and sweat, a clean violence against the mess of the wound. She turned back to the man on her cot, the firelight glinting off the steel in her hands. He was a stranger, a problem brought to her door by nothing more than chance and bad luck. But for now, he was hers to save. His eyes flickered open as she approached, the color of a stormy sky, clouded with pain but lucid. They fixed on her face, then on the scissors in her hand. He didn't speak, didn't protest. He simply watched her, his jaw tight, a silent concession passing between them. He understood what was to come, and she understood that he would bear it. She took a breath, the air tasting of pine smoke and the coming night, and began to cut away the blood-stiffened fabric of his trousers. The work had started. The denim was thick, woven for a hard life, and now it was fused to his skin with drying blood. Her scissors, honed to a razor's edge, worked carefully, snipping a line up the seam of his trousers. The sound was intimate and unnerving, a soft, deliberate shearing that seemed to echo in the cabin's profound quiet. She worked with her head bowed, the silver streak in her hair catching the firelight. Her focus was absolute, her hands moving with a steadiness that belied the grim task. She did not look at his face, did not allow herself to think of him as a man with a name or a history. He was a body, a wound, a problem to be solved with needle and thread. This detachment was a shield she had forged in the long, bloody nights in field hospitals, a necessary armor against the tide of suffering that had once threatened to drown her. He watched her, his world narrowed to the small circle of her lamplight. Pain was a constant, a roaring fire in his leg, but through it, he saw her with a strange clarity. He saw the set of her mouth, a firm line of concentration. He saw the texture of her skin, pulled taut over fine bones, weathered by sun and wind. He saw the strength in her wrists as she peeled the heavy fabric away from the raw flesh. She did not flinch. She did not make a sound of pity or disgust. Her expression was one of neutral competence, the look of a craftsman sizing up a piece of damaged wood. It was, he thought through a haze of agony, the most reassuring expression he had ever seen on a woman's face. There was no ring on her left hand. The observation surfaced in his mind, unbidden and irrelevant, and then submerged again beneath the next wave of pain. The wound was fully exposed now. It was a deep, ragged tear, not from a bullet, but from something sharp and cruel. A shard of rock in a fall, perhaps, or the horn of a spooked steer. It had sliced through muscle, and the edges were dirty, already showing the first signs of inflammation. Infection was the real enemy, more patient and more deadly than any blade. Eliza knew this. She dipped a fresh cloth in the now steaming water, wrung it out, and began the agonizing work of cleaning the gash. He hissed, a sharp intake of breath, and his body tensed, every muscle coiling to pull away from the source of the fire. "Hold still," she said. Her voice was low and even, not a command so much as a simple statement of fact. It was the first thing she had said to him. He forced his body to relax, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the cot. He focused on her hands again, a strange anchor in the swirling torment. They were not soft hands. The pads of her fingers were calloused, the nails cut short and clean. These were hands that knew work, that could split wood, pull weeds, and, it seemed, hold a man's life together with nothing but pressure and skill. She worked methodically, her touch firm and certain, cleaning the wound with a thoroughness that was its own kind of mercy, however much it hurt. When she was satisfied, it was as clean as she could make it. She reached for the whiskey bottle. "This will burn," she stated, meeting his eyes for the first time. Her own were a deep, clear brown, startlingly direct. There was no apology in them. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He had expected it. He braced himself. The whiskey felt like liquid flame, a searing, cleansing agony that made his vision swim and a raw cry catch in his throat. He choked it back, his breath coming in ragged pants. Through the blur of tears that sprang to his eyes, he saw her threading the curved needle with a length of black silk. The movement was deft, practiced, hypnotic. She tested the thread with a tug, then leaned in close, her face just inches from his leg. He could feel the warmth of her breath, smell the faint, clean scent of soap and wood smoke that clung to her. The world shrank to the point of the needle, her steady hand, and the rasp of his own breathing in the otherwise silent cabin. The first stitch was a sharp, biting pinch, a new and specific pain laid over the general throb. He held perfectly still. He would not move. He would not make a sound. It was the only thing he could give her in return. The needle moved in a steady, rhythmic pattern, a grim and delicate dance. In, through, out. Pull tight. The whisper of the silk thread passing through his flesh was a sound he would remember for the rest of his life. She worked without pause, her brow furrowed in concentration. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only other sound besides their breathing. He found himself counting the stitches, a strange litany to keep his mind from the pain. 7, 8, 9. Each one a small victory against the gaping wound, a black thread pulling him back from the edge. He broke the silence, his voice a dry rasp. "What's your name?" She didn't look up, her eyes fixed on her work. The needle paused for a fraction of a second before plunging in again. "Eliza." The name was simple, solid. It suited her. He waited until she had pulled another stitch tight before speaking again. "Jed." She gave a small nod of acknowledgement, a gesture so slight he might have missed it if he hadn't been watching her so intently. The silence returned, but it was different now. They were no longer a stranger and a healer. They were Eliza and Jed. The needle continued its work, closing the distance between the two sides of the wound, stitching together more than just skin and muscle in the quiet, firelit cabin. 10, 11. The pain was beginning to dull, replaced by a strange, floating exhaustion. "You've done this before," he stated, the words slurring slightly. It wasn't a question. "I have," she confirmed, her voice still low and even. She tied off a stitch, her movements precise and economical. "The war taught many things." The war. The words hung in the air between them. It explained the absence of fear in her eyes, the skill in her hands, the profound stillness she carried with her. He had seen doctors in the field, men who had become butchers out of necessity, their hands shaking with drink or fatigue. Her hands were rock steady. He felt a wave of something he couldn't name, gratitude, awe, a deep and profound respect. She was saving his life with a competence that asked for nothing in return. He watched the last few stitches, his eyelids growing heavy. The fire in his leg was banking, becoming a dull, manageable heat. Her face, illuminated by the lamp, was the last thing he saw before the darkness pulled him under. The image of her concentration, a final, reassuring anchor. He was safe. He knew it in his bones. The final knot was tied, the excess silk thread snipped clean. Eliza sat back on her heels, the muscles in her back and shoulders screaming in protest. The wound was closed, a neat, black line against the inflamed skin of his thigh. It was clean work, the best she could do. Now it was up to his body and whatever luck he had left. She covered the stitched wound with a clean pad of linen, binding it firmly in place with long strips of cloth. He was unconscious now, his breathing deep and even, his face pale in the lamplight. The ordeal was over for him for the moment. For her, the next phase was just beginning. She rose stiffly and moved about the cabin, her earlier efficiency now slowed by a bone-deep weariness. She cleaned her tools, wiping the needle and scissors with a whiskey-soaked rag before placing them back in their leather case. She gathered the bloodied strips of his trousers and her own cleaning cloths, pushing them into the heart of the fire. They hissed and smoldered, a foul-smelling sacrifice that slowly turned to ash. The act was a ritual of purification, of erasing the violence that had been done, of returning her small, orderly world to a state of calm. She washed her hands in the basin, scrubbing at the faint reddish stains under her nails until her skin was raw. The cabin was quiet except for the crackling fire and the man's steady breathing. It was a sound she was not used to. For 7 years, the only breath she had heard in the night was her own. His presence filled the small space, a heavy, masculine reality that felt both intrusive and strangely grounding. She looked over at him, his long frame barely fitting on her cot. In sleep, the harsh lines of his face had softened. He looked younger, more vulnerable. A dark lock of hair had fallen across his forehead, and she had the absurd impulse to brush it away. She resisted, turning back to the hearth instead. She filled a small pot with water and added a handful of dried herbs and the last of a chicken carcass she had saved for broth. The simmering soup soon filled the cabin with a savory, comforting aroma, overlaying the lingering scents of blood and whiskey. Care was more than stitching. It was warmth and nourishment, the patient work of waiting through the night. She pulled her chair close to the fire, but angled it so she could watch him. She would not sleep tonight. Fever was the enemy that crept in after the blade was gone, and she would need to be vigilant. Hours passed. The moon climbed high in the sky, its pale light filtering through the single window. The fire burned down to glowing embers. Sometime after midnight, he began to stir, muttering something unintelligible. She was at his side in an instant, her hand going to his forehead. It was hot, slick with sweat. The fever had arrived, as she had known it would. She dipped a cloth in the cool water from the bucket by the door and laid it across his brow. He sighed, a faint sound of relief, and his restlessness subsided. She sat on the edge of the cot, re-wetting the cloth every few minutes, her presence a quiet guard against the heat consuming him. In his fevered state, he was unguarded. He spoke a few names, Samuel and Maria, his voice thick with a sorrow that felt old and deep. She listened, not out of curiosity, but because it was part of her vigil. She was tending not just to his body, but to the unseen wounds that surfaced in the dark. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of gray and rose, the fever began to break. The heat receded from his skin, leaving him drenched in sweat but cool to the touch. He was still sleeping, but it was a true healing sleep now. Eliza felt a wave of relief so profound it left her weak. She had won the first battle. She leaned her head back against the log wall, closing her eyes for just a moment. The man's steady breathing a quiet rhythm that finally lulled her into a light, watchful doze. 2 days passed in a quiet rhythm of care and recovery. Eliza moved between the hearth, the water bucket, and his bedside, a silent, efficient steward of his healing. She fed him broth, coaxing him to drink when he was half awake, his body too weak to protest. She changed the dressing on his wound, noting with satisfaction that the angry redness was receding, the flesh knitting itself back together cleanly. He drifted in and out of a healing sleep, his periods of lucidity growing longer. During those times he would watch her, his storm-blue eyes following her as she moved about the cabin. The silence between them was not awkward, but full, a space of shared experience that needed no words to fill it. On the evening of the 3rd day, the fever was gone completely, and he was able to sit up, propped against the wall. The color had returned to his face, and the sharp edge of pain had dulled to a persistent, manageable ache. Eliza brought him a bowl of thin stew, thick with potatoes, and a little salt pork. He took it from her, his hand surprisingly steady. "Thank you," he said, his voice stronger now, less of a rasp. "You need to eat," she replied simply, taking her own bowl to the chair by the fire. They ate in silence for a few minutes. The firelight flickered, casting a warm, intimate glow. The world outside the cabin felt 1,000 miles away. It was he who spoke first, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "How does a woman like you end up alone on a mountain like this?" The question was direct, but his tone was gentle, curious rather than intrusive. Eliza swirled the last of the stew in her bowl, considering her answer. She had not told her story to anyone in years, but this man, who had bled on her floor and trusted her with his life, seemed to have earned a piece of it. "My husband Thomas bought this land after the war. He thought it would be a new start, a place to forget." "He was a soldier?" Jed asked. "He was," she said, her voice quiet. "He came back from it whole in body, but not in spirit. The war took something from him that he could never get back. He couldn't settle, couldn't stand the noise of towns, the press of people." She looked over at Jed, whose face was shadowed, unreadable. "He died 2 winters after we got here, a fall while he was out hunting. I buried him myself, up on the ridge where the pines grow thickest." She had stayed, not out of love for the place, but because she had nowhere else to go. The world had moved on without her. Jed was silent for a long moment, absorbing her words. "And your skill with the needle?" A small, sad smile touched Eliza's lips. "I was a nurse in the war, sir." The words were barely a whisper, an admission of a past she kept locked away. "I followed my husband's regiment. I learned to stitch in tents that smelled of canvas and death, with cannon fire for a lullaby." Jed lowered his bowl, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He looked at her hands, then at her face, seeing her fully for the first time. Not just as a healer, but as a survivor, a veteran of the same crucible that had marked him and every other man of their generation. When he spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "Then God sent you twice," he said softly. The words landed in the quiet cabin with the weight of a benediction. Eliza felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so foreign she barely recognized it. It was the feeling of being seen. She cleared her throat, turning the conversation away from herself. "And you, Jed? What brings you riding so hard through these mountains that you end up at my door?" He looked down at his bandaged leg, then back at the fire. "I was running," he admitted, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Not from the law, if that's what you're thinking. From a life that didn't fit anymore. My father left me a business in the East, shipping. Ledgers and accounts and men in stiff collars who never saw the sun. It was a gilded cage." He paused. "My brother Samuel, he was the one meant for it. He was killed at Gettysburg. I took his place. I tried for 10 years to be the man my father wanted, the man my brother would have been. A few months ago, I just walked away, sold my shares. I was riding west, looking for something quiet, something real. The fall had been a stupid accident, his horse losing its footing on a shale slide. He had lain there for hours, bleeding, before managing to pull himself into the saddle and let the horse wander, hoping for a miracle. It had brought him here. Eliza listened, her heart aching with a familiar sorrow. A dead brother. A life derailed by the war. His story was different from hers, but the tune was the same. They were both ghosts, haunted by the past, searching for a place where the noise finally stopped. In the flickering firelight, the space between them seemed to shrink, the shared weight of their histories forging a bond stronger and deeper than the silk threads that held his wound closed. He stayed for another week. His strength returned slowly, a testament to his own resilience and her patient care. They fell into a comfortable domesticity, the cabin a small, self-contained world. He learned the rhythms of her life, the early mornings tending her garden, the quiet afternoons mending or reading from her small collection of books, the evenings spent in near-silent companionship by the fire. He watched her hands, marveling at their versatility. He saw them gently coaxing seedlings from the earth, expertly kneading dough for bread, and then each evening, carefully changing the dressing on his leg. Her touch was always professional, yet he found himself craving it. The brief, impersonal contact, a strange and powerful comfort. One afternoon, as she was checking the stitches, he asked about the valley below. "Who owns this land? All of it?" "A man named Thorn," she said, her voice flat, without inflection. She snipped the last of the stitches, her movements precise. The wound had healed into a clean pink scar. "Jedediah Thorn. He came in a few years back, bought the big ranch at the mouth of the valley, and then just kept buying. Bought the water rights to the creek first. That was the beginning of the end for most folks." Jedediah. The name struck him like a physical blow. He remained silent, his body rigid. She continued, unaware of the turmoil her words had caused. "He didn't force anyone out, not with guns. He was cleverer than that. He just made it impossible to stay. The creek dried up to a trickle for the homesteads upstream. Our crops failed. Thomas, my husband, he tried to fight it. Went to the land office, talked to a lawyer in town. But Thorn had all the papers in order. He had the money and the power. It broke Thomas's spirit long before the fall broke his neck. He said men like Thorn were just waging a different kind of war." She finished tying the final bandage, her work done. She finally looked up at him and saw the look on his face. It was a mask of anguish and self-recrimination. "Eliza," he began, his voice hoarse. He had to tell her. He had to say the words, no matter the cost. "My name. It's not just Jed." She waited, her brown eyes watchful, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. "My full name," he said, the words tasting like poison, "is Jedediah Thorn." The air left the cabin. The crackle of the fire sounded like a roar in the sudden, absolute silence. Eliza stared at him, her face paling. The man she had saved. The man whose quiet presence had begun to fill the empty spaces in her life. He was the architect of her ruin, the faceless force that had destroyed her husband and left her in this profound isolation. The whiskey bottle, the needle, the broth, the nights spent watching over his fever, every act of care she had given him suddenly felt like a betrayal of the life she had lost, a betrayal of Thomas. She took a step back, her hands rising as if to ward him off. The intimacy they had built over the past 10 days shattered into 1,000 pieces, the space between them now a vast, unbridgeable chasm of history and grief. He saw the trust in her eyes curdle into a look of deep, profound hurt, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had just inflicted a wound far deeper than the one she had so carefully stitched closed. Before either of them could speak, to try and bridge the chasm that had opened between them, the sound of horses interrupted the fragile, broken silence. It was not the sound of a single rider, but of several, moving with purpose up the narrow track to her cabin. Eliza's head snapped toward the door, her instincts honed by years of solitude immediately sensing a threat. Jedediah, Thorne, pushed himself up, his hand going to the wall for support, his face grim. He knew who it was. "They've found me," he said, his voice low. "Who?" Eliza's voice was sharp, laced with a new, cold suspicion. "The law?" "No," he said, his eyes meeting hers, full of a misery that was almost palpable. "My men." 3 riders emerged from the tree line, their figures stark against the afternoon sky. They were not lawmen. They were cowboys, hard-faced and armed, their movements efficient and professional. They reined in before the cabin, their horses stamping impatiently. One man, older than the others, with a weathered face and a sweeping gray mustache, dismounted. He moved with an air of authority, his gaze sweeping over the small cabin, the neat stacks of firewood, and finally settling on Eliza as she stood in the doorway, a silent, unmovable guardian. "Ma'am," the man said, his voice a gravelly baritone. He touched the brim of his hat, but it was a gesture of formality, not genuine respect. "We're looking for our employer, Mr. Thorne. Saw a horse matching his down in the meadow. Figured he might have found shelter here." Eliza said nothing. She simply stood there, her body a barricade. Behind her, in the shadows of the cabin, Jedediah moved forward, leaning heavily on a walking stick he had carved. He appeared in the doorway beside her, and the foreman's eyes widened slightly in relief, followed by a flicker of stern disapproval. "Jedediah," the foreman said, his tone shifting. "We've been searching for you for over a week. The whole valley's been turned upside down. We thought you were dead." "As you can see, Cutter, I am not," Jedediah replied, his voice strained but firm. "Thanks to Mrs. Stowe." The foreman, Cutter, gave Eliza a dismissive glance, his eyes cataloging her worn dress, her bare feet, her remote, wild surroundings. He clearly saw her as little more than a squatter, an inconvenience. "We'll bring a wagon up for you. We can have you back at the main house by nightfall. There's a doctor waiting in town." The offer hung in the air, a stark reminder of the world Jedediah belonged to. A world of doctors on call, of men who could turn a valley upside down looking for him. A world of power and wealth that was utterly alien to Eliza's existence. It was a world that had crushed her and her husband without a second thought. For the first time, she saw him not as Jed, the quiet man with haunted eyes, but as Mr. Thorne, the rancher, the force of nature that had reshaped her life. The distance between them felt infinite. She stepped back from the doorway, leaving him to face his men, to return to his life. It had nothing to do with her. The work was done. The debt, she supposed, was paid. Her cabin was hers again, and the silence she had grown accustomed to was waiting to reclaim her. Jedediah felt her retreat, the small movement a physical blow. He saw the closed-off expression on her face, the way she pulled her solitude around her like a protective cloak. Cutter was still talking, laying out the logistics of his return, assuming his compliance. And why wouldn't he? It was the sensible thing to do. Go back to his comfortable ranch house, his soft bed, the doctor his money could buy. Leave this place, this woman whose life he had inadvertently ruined. It was the easiest path. He could send her money, a fortune by her standards, enough to salve his conscience. He could ride away and let the scar on his leg be the only reminder of his time in this cabin. But as he looked at Eliza, standing by her cold hearth with her back to him, he knew he couldn't. Leaving would be a confirmation of everything she believed him to be, a careless man of power who took what he needed and moved on. The past 10 days had not just been about his body healing. In the quiet of this cabin, under the care of this steady, competent woman, something else had begun to mend within him. The emptiness he had been running from had, for a brief time, been filled. He had found something real, just as he'd hoped. To leave now would be to lose it, perhaps forever. He made his choice. He turned his full attention to his foreman, his posture straightening, the authority that was his birthright settling over him like a mantle. "Cutter," he said, his voice ringing with a command that made the older man stand up straighter. "I appreciate your concern, but I am not leaving." Cutter stared at him, dumbfounded. "Sir, you're not well? This is no place for you to recover." His gaze flickered to Eliza again, this time with open disdain. "This place is precisely where I will recover," Jedediah stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Mrs. Stowe's care has been more than sufficient. You will take your men and return to the ranch. You will inform them that I am fine and that I will send word when I am ready to return." "But Mr. Thorne—" "That is an order, Cutter," Jedediah said, his tone dropping, becoming quiet and intensely dangerous. "Do you understand it?" The foreman's face hardened, but he knew that tone. He had heard it only a few times before, and it was not to be challenged. He gave a curt, angry nod. "Yes, sir." He turned without another word, swung himself onto his horse, and motioned for the other men to follow. They wheeled their horses around and galloped back down the track, their departure as sudden as their arrival. The sound of their hoofbeats faded, leaving behind a silence thick with unspoken words. Jedediah stood in the doorway, his leg throbbing from the effort of standing. He had dismissed his entire world for her. He had chosen this small cabin, this woman, over everything he possessed. He turned, his heart pounding, to face Eliza. She had turned from the hearth and was watching him, her expression unreadable, her arms crossed over her chest. He had made his choice. Now he had to wait and see if she would make hers. The dust settled. The silence that rushed back in to fill the space left by the horses was heavier than before, charged with the weight of his decision. Eliza remained by the hearth, her posture rigid, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. He had stayed. The powerful Mr. Thorne, who could summon doctors and wagons and teams of men, had chosen to remain in her cramped, rustic cabin. He had chosen her care over the comfort and privilege of his own world. The gesture was so profound, so unexpected, that it cracked the protective shell of her anger and resentment, leaving her feeling exposed and uncertain. "You should have gone with them," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It was a test." "I know," he replied, his gaze steady. He didn't move from the doorway. "But the doctor in town didn't save my life. You did." He limped over to the single chair by the table and lowered himself into it carefully, the effort costing him. He looked tired, the confrontation with his men having drained his reserves. He had not only defied them, but he had also laid claim to a place that wasn't his, a place he had, in a way, created for her through his ambition. He was a walking contradiction, the cause of her isolation and the first person to breach it in 7 years. That evening, a cold front moved in. The wind howled around the corners of the cabin, rattling the window pane and finding its way through 100 tiny chinks in the log walls. The temperature dropped precipitously. Eliza built up the fire until it roared, but the cabin remained drafty, a pocket of fragile warmth in a vast, cold wilderness. She gave Jedediah her thickest quilt, but it wasn't enough. As night deepened, she saw him shivering, his teeth chattering despite his proximity to the fire. The chill was getting into his bones, a dangerous thing for a man still recovering from a serious injury. She watched him for a long time, her heart at war with itself. Every instinct told her to keep her distance, to guard the solitude he had already so thoroughly disrupted. But the healer in her, the part of her that had answered the call of his pain at her door, could not stand by and watch him suffer. Her duty of care had not ended when she took out the stitches. Without a word, she took the thin blanket from her own empty cot. She walked over to him, her shadow long in the firelight. He looked up at her, his blue eyes clouded with discomfort. But he said nothing, made no request. He would freeze before he asked her for more than she had already given. She hesitated for only a second, then laid the blanket over the quilt, tucking it in around his shoulders. Her fingers brushed against his neck, and the contact was like a spark in the cold air. He was still shivering. She knew with a sinking certainty that blankets alone would not be enough. There was only one other source of warmth in the cabin, her own body. The thought was scandalous, terrifying, and yet completely practical. It was what she would have done in the field hospitals for a soldier dying of shock, a clinical application of warmth to save a life. But this was not a nameless soldier. This was Jedediah Thorne. She made her decision with the same pragmatism she brought to everything else. She walked to the hearth, banked the fire for the night, and then returned to the cot. She didn't look at him. She simply lifted a corner of the blankets and slipped in beside him, lying on her side, her back to him. The space was narrow, their bodies pressed together from shoulder to knee. His shivering was a violent tremor that shook the small bed. She lay perfectly still, rigid, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was not about desire. It was about survival. It was an act of profound and profoundly intimate care. Slowly, gradually, the heat from her body began to transfer to his. His violent shivers subsided into smaller tremors, and then, finally, ceased altogether. The warmth of her presence was a comfort more potent than any fire or blanket. He felt the rigid line of her back against his chest, the soft scent of her hair, the quiet rhythm of her breathing. He was overwhelmed with a sense of gratitude so immense it felt like an ache in his chest. This woman, whose life he had unknowingly damaged, was now giving him her own body's warmth to keep him from harm. In the darkness, he reached out a hesitant hand, not to pull her closer, but simply to acknowledge her sacrifice. He laid his hand gently on her shoulder. It was a simple, chaste touch, but it was electric. It was a question, an apology, and a thank you, all without a single word. She did not pull away. After a long moment, she spoke, her voice a near whisper in the dark. Eliza. He understood. He was not to be the powerful Mr. Thorne in this bed. He was not even Jed, the wounded stranger. He was a man being cared for by a woman whose name was Eliza. Jedediah, he whispered back, giving her his full name not as a confession of his status, but as an offering. A gift of his true self. They lay like that for the rest of the night, two solitary souls pressed together against the cold, their names spoken into the darkness, a quiet vow. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin, a fragile peace had settled, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Months passed. The deep snows of winter gave way to the slow, muddy thaw of spring. The world outside Eliza's cabin came back to life, the aspens budding, the creek swelling with meltwater. Inside the cabin, a new life had taken root as well. Jedediah had never left. His leg healed completely, the angry scar fading to a pale silver line, a permanent reminder of his arrival. He had become a fixture in her life, his presence as natural as the sunrise. He chopped wood, repaired the leaking roof, and helped her plant the spring garden, his large hands surprisingly gentle with the tender seedlings. He had sent a letter back to his ranch with a passing trapper, a short, simple message that his foreman, Cutter, was to manage things until his return. No date was given. He had, for all intents and purposes, abdicated his throne. The power and wealth that had defined him seemed a distant memory, an ill-fitting coat he had been happy to shed. Here, with Eliza, he was simply Jedediah, a man who was learning the quiet satisfaction of building a life with his own two hands. The chasm between their pasts had not vanished, but they had begun to build a bridge across it. He talked of his brother, Samuel, and the crushing weight of his father's expectations. She spoke of Thomas, of his laughter before the war, and the slow, sad dimming of his light after. They did not seek to absolve or forget. They simply bore witness to each other's history, their shared stories weaving a new tapestry of understanding. He had used his resources, quietly and from a distance, to make amends. The water rights to the upper valley were deeded back to a common trust for the few remaining homesteaders. He had a lawyer in town purchase the deed to Eliza's land and put it in her name, free and clear, a document she now kept in a small wooden box, a symbol of a debt he had insisted on repaying. Their intimacy had grown slowly, organically, rooted in the shared warmth of that first cold night. It was a relationship built not on grand passion, but on a foundation of mutual respect and quiet companionship. A hand on the small of her back as she leaned over the fire. The way he would look at her across the table, his eyes full of a quiet wonder. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, he had reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwined with hers, a perfect fit. He had leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, questioning touch of his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of frantic desire, but of deep, abiding affection, a promise of safety and belonging. One late spring afternoon, as Jedediah was mending a section of fence at the edge of the property, he heard a shout. A boy from a neighboring homestead was running toward him, his face pale with panic. "Mr. Thorne, come quick. It's my pa. He fell from the hayloft. His leg, it's twisted up bad." Jedediah nodded, his face calm. "Go get your mother. Tell her to meet us at Mrs. Stowe's cabin." He helped the boy onto his own horse. "Go on now. Ride fast." He walked back to the cabin, his long strides even and sure. He found Eliza in the garden, her hands covered in rich, dark earth. He told her what had happened. She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw no hesitation, only the familiar, steady competence he had first witnessed when he himself lay bleeding at her door. She wiped her hands on her apron and went inside to prepare. She laid out a clean cloth on the table, her leather satchel of tools beside it. She filled the kettle and hung it over the fire. The movements were the same, but everything was different. When she turned from the hearth, Jedediah was standing there, holding out a strip of clean linen for her. He had anticipated her next need. He was not her patient anymore. He was her partner. Minutes later, the family arrived, the injured man groaning in a makeshift wagon bed. Together, Jedediah and the man's wife helped him into the cabin and onto the table. The man's leg was broken, a bad fracture of the tibia. Eliza assessed the injury, her touch firm and knowing. "I'll need you to hold him steady, Jedediah," she said, her voice calm and authoritative, "and keep him talking." As she began her work, setting the bone with a sickening crack that made the wife gasp, Jedediah knelt by the man's head, He held his hand, speaking in a low, soothing voice, telling him about the fence he was mending, about the way the aspens were leafing out on the ridge. He was an anchor, a steady presence in a storm of pain, just as she had been for him. Eliza worked, her focus absolute, but she was aware of him, of his strength, of his quiet support. They were a team, moving in an unspoken rhythm. She had spent so many years believing that her skill was a solitary burden, a remnant of a life she had lost. But now she understood. Healing was not a solitary act. It was a partnership. To be needed was a heavy weight to bear alone, but to be needed alongside someone you trusted, someone who saw you and stood with you, that was a different thing entirely. That was not a burden. It was a gift. It was, she thought, as she began to wrap the splint, the quiet, sturdy architecture of a home,